I grew up surrounded by luxury and security, in a house where every object seemed to be not only a necessity, but also part of an elaborate image created by Mr. and Mrs. Hayes. Our house in Austin, Texas, towered in one of the most prestigious neighborhoods, and everyone who drove by paid attention to it. Every corner of the house was filled with reminders of the successes, status, and lofty aspirations of my parents, recognized lawyers, people with impeccable reputations and unlimited influence. But despite this greatness, it always seemed to me that I was just a shadow lurking in a corner of a luxurious mansion, barely discernible behind the reflection of parental success and the sparkling smile of Michael's younger brother. Michael was their pride, their light. He easily coped with his studies, always exceeding the expectations of the teachers, and it seemed that just when he looked at them, a warmth flashed in the eyes of his parents, which I had never seen addressed to me. His success was like a quiet but powerful rebuke, a comparison in which I constantly lost. Unlike him, Lily, had a hard time trying to meet these high, sometimes unrealistic requirements, which were set before me no less severely than before him. Over and over again, I tried, studied, refused to play with friends and evenings in the park, all in order to get their approval. But no matter how hard I tried, there was always something not enough for them. That evening, when I returned home from school, my heart was pounding so hard that it seemed to me that its pounding echoed throughout the house. I carried the test results with me, the fruits of long hours of preparation, endless exercises, and lists of rules memorized by heart. For the first time, I felt a certain confidence in myself, but as soon as I crossed the threshold, I heard the muffled voices of my parents from the living room. "She disappoints us," my mother's cold voice pierced me like an icy needle. "We gave her everything, every chance, every opportunity," she added, "and what do we get in return?" The words weighed heavily, each one like a stone descending on my heart. I froze at the bedroom door, frozen in an attempt to cope with this unexpected pain, but tears were treacherously rolling down my cheeks. I wanted to shout, I wanted them to hear me, to know how desperately I was trying to meet their expectations. But the words stuck in my throat, like too bitter a truth that cannot be swallowed. After dinner, my parents came up to me, and I saw a strange expression on their faces, something more icy than ever. The father, with cold detachment, said, "Lily, we can't go on like this. You need to get ready, otherwise, you'll have to find another place to live." His words sounded so determined that it took my breath away. I looked at him, hoping that any minute now he would smile, say that it was just a terrible joke. But his gaze was serious, irrevocable. "You're not fulfilling your potential," he added, as if this was the greatest tragedy of their lives. Fighting back tears, I whispered in horror, "Where am I going?" But there was no response. My father just turned around and walked away, leaving me alone in the exhausted silence. When I realized that my tears would not touch anyone anymore, I packed a small bag, threw a few books and a couple of things into it and left the house, feeling completely lost. The night in Austin was cold and frightening, although the city lived its usual life. Laughter and music could be heard somewhere, lights of restaurants and cafes twinkled on the horizon, and muffled conversations of passers-by could be heard from afar. I walked through this noisy, alien world without feeling the slightest connection to it, as if everything that was happening around me were just scenes from a movie to which I did not belong. Several hours have passed. My legs were tired, my thoughts were confused, but I didn't know what to do next. Despair seemed to envelop me, and the darkness intensified this feeling. And at the moment when it seemed to me that all hope was lost, when there was nothing left inside me but emptiness, a familiar figure appeared in front of me. It was my Aunt Nancy. Her face, full of anxiety and tenderness, was a real salvation for me. "Lily, what are you doing here?" she whispered, looking at me with undisguised concern. I didn't know where else to go, there was nowhere to go back, no one to turn to for support. My voice trembled as I said these words, opening up to Nancy, to her kind and patient gaze. As soon as I finished, she hugged me tightly and tenderly, as if she was afraid that I would disappear into the night again. "Come with me, you're safe now," she whispered, and in her words there was the warmth that I had been looking for so long, the support that I hadn't even dared to dream of. She was 40, and as the manager of a small, cozy restaurant in the city center, Nancy was not looking for fame or luxury, content with the modest joys of life. She's always been my refuge, the one person I've been drawn to like a lighthouse in a storm. She believed in me like no one else, and that was the most valuable thing I could get from an adult. When we got to her small apartment, I felt the weight of what I had experienced fall off me, and perhaps for the first time I felt that everything could be different. Nancy quickly made me a plate of warm, fragrant soup, and when she handed it to me, her gaze was full of concern. "I was so worried about you," she said, and her voice sounded soft, like the notes of a quiet song lulling me to sleep after days of fear and pain. "You can stay here as long as you need to," she added, and I felt a new feeling arise in me, hope, timid, barely noticeable, but still real. Life with Nancy gradually began to change me. Her concern filled the void that had remained in my soul for so long. Her faith in my strength, in the fact that I am capable of many things, warmed and inspired. She often told me, "You're a good girl, Lily. You can achieve anything you want." Under her wing, it was as if I had begun to build myself anew, now not for the sake of other people's expectations, but for the sake of myself. Her unconditional support has given me the confidence I lost a long time ago. With a new purpose, I immersed myself in my studies. The desire to prove that I was worthy of success burned in me with unprecedented force. I studied even more diligently, spending hours poring over books, diligently preparing for each lesson. Now I had a goal, to become the best version of myself, to get rid of the shadow of the past once and for all. Meanwhile, my younger brother Michael began to feel the full weight of parental expectations. One evening, walking through our old neighborhood, I noticed him sitting on the steps of our house with a guitar in his hands. In the light of the night lanterns, he seemed tired, lost. I walked up to him, carefully sat down next to him and quietly asked, "Hey, are you okay?" Michael, frowning, replied that he was just thinking. "Mom and Dad want me to follow in their footsteps, so that I become like them. But I want to make music," he admitted, looking at his guitar with dark sadness in his eyes. "It's like they don't care what I want." I listened to him, and it was so familiar, as if I could hear my own thoughts. "I understand you," I said, feeling the pain that united us at that moment. "You have to follow your desire, Michael. Your dreams matter." He looked at me uncertainly. "But they'll be so angry," he sighed. "I do not know how to explain it to them." I smiled at him encouragingly. "Maybe it's time to stand up for yourself," I whispered, remembering how I had to find my own way, how difficult it was to take the first step towards freedom. Michael nodded silently, and I saw a glimmer of determination in his gaze. A few weeks have passed, and during this time, living with Nancy, I have gradually transformed. Under her kind words, caring attention and sincere interest in my success, I flourished. But at the same time, the gap between Michael and our parents was getting wider. One day they found out that Michael had enrolled in a performing arts school where he could finally follow his passion. This discovery turned into a real storm. That evening, I returned from school and found them having a heated argument in the living room. "You're throwing your life away," his father shouted, his face crimson with anger. Michael stood in front of her, his head held high. "No, Dad, I do what I love," he snapped, his voice sounding firm and confident, as if he had finally found himself. Mom intervened, Her tone was cold and stern. That's not how we raised you. You're wasting your potential. I was filled with anger, and, unable to resist, I stepped forward. This is unfair. He has the right to choose his path. But my father abruptly turned to me and barked, "Stay away from this, Lily. You've done enough damage already." His words were the final blow, strengthening the gap between us, which could not be reduced. I watched as Michael continued to stand his ground, his face grim but determined. School became my refuge, my little world, where I could forget for a while what it was like to be a failure in the eyes of my own parents. I immersed myself in my studies with such obsession that others were surprised at my persistence. Every assessment, every praise from the teachers fueled my will to prove to myself, and maybe to the world, that I was capable of more than was expected of me. It was my way of making myself known, at least in the quiet of the school corridors. In rare moments of rest, I often thought about Michael, about how he lives under his parents' roof, how he copes with the same oppressive expectations that have tormented me for so long. One day I decided and dialed his number, listening to the staccato beeps on the line. "Hey, how are you?" I began, trying to sound cheerful, but he seemed to sense my excitement right away. "Yes, it's the same," he sighed heavily, and there was bitterness in his voice. "You know, Mom and Dad. They still think I'm about to go to law school, as they want me to." In these words, filled with disappointment and hidden pain, I recognized myself, the same suppressed voice with which I used to speak myself. "But you're not going to go that way," I said firmly, like a spell that I wanted to protect him from other people's ambitions. "No. But it's difficult, Lily. They put pressure on me every day," he admitted, and there was a subtle longing in his words. "Sometimes I just want to run away like you." This confession sparked in me a desire to help him, to offer what Nancy had once given me. "Maybe you should come to my place. Stay with us, stay with Nancy, figure it out," I offered enthusiastically. Michael fell silent, and I could hear his breathing become uneven, as if he was struggling with his own fears and insecurities. Months passed, and my efforts at school began to bear fruit. I graduated from high school with honors and received a scholarship to study at one of the most prestigious universities. The letter of enrollment came suddenly. Its white envelope seemed to me the embodiment of all my dreams and hopes. I hugged him tightly to me, my heart was pounding, and the first person I wanted to tell the news to, of course, was Nancy. "I did it, Nancy. I'm going to become a doctor." I cried, and tears of joy involuntarily appeared in my eyes. Nancy hugged me as warmly as if she were hugging her own daughter. "I always knew you could do it, Lily. You deserve this happiness," she said, and there was such pride in her words that my heart melted. But under this joy there was a barely noticeable fear, how my parents would react, who were used to seeing in my successes only steps towards their ideals, their desires. I decided to call them and tell them about my victory. Their reaction was lifeless, clumsy, almost forced. That's great, Lily," her father said, but his voice was flat, impassive, as if he wasn't talking to his daughter, but to a complete stranger. "But remember, medical school is not easy. We will need to work seriously there," he added, and there was a cold hint of possible defeat in his words. My joy seemed to fade under this icy shower. "Why can't you just be proud of her?" Nancy suddenly intervened, her voice ringing with barely suppressed anger. "She worked on it, and you should appreciate her efforts." The answer was a heavy silence that hung over the room, and this silence hurt me painfully. They couldn't understand, or didn't want to. They still saw me as that little girl who had to follow in their shadow, live by their rules. That shadow of the past was still trying to engulf me when I immersed myself in medical school. The training turned out to be difficult, sometimes unbearable, but there was a special, inexplicable pleasure in it. I greedily absorbed knowledge, spent hours poring over textbooks, and learned to understand complex concepts that only strengthened my passion for medicine. My late night studying were sometimes interrupted by messages from Michael. "I just finished another song. It's about getting rid of expectations," he wrote one evening, and I couldn't help but smile when I read his words. "I can't wait to hear it," I replied, feeling genuinely proud of my brother. Michael continued to find his way, slowly but surely freeing himself from the shackles of parental hopes. As time went on, my successes grew like ripe fruits on the branches. But my parents suddenly showed interest again by sending me a long, cold letter. "We suggest you think about law school, Lily. Maybe you'll have time to change your mind. We are ready to help with the payment if you decide to enroll there. Think about what a law degree might mean for your future." These words seemed to cut my heart with a knife, igniting anger. They never saw me as a doctor, a person who sincerely wanted to help others, just a formless projection of their own desires. "I'm not interested in being a lawyer," I exclaimed, clenching my fists, as if shouting it not at the computer screen, but right in their faces. I was going to become a doctor, to follow the path that I chose myself. My rage was boiling, and at that moment Nancy quietly entered the room, found me in this state. My eyes were shining with suppressed tears. "What happened?" she asked cautiously, her voice full of concern. "They think I should give up everything and follow their path," I said, and at that moment my pain and resentment burst out. Ever since I heard Nancy's words, it's like I've been charged with her faith in me. She saw in me a power that I sometimes doubted myself, and every time I felt disappointment and pain returning to me like tides, her quiet but firm voice reminded me that I choose my own path. Even when I was shrouded in the shadow of the past, I knew that I needed to move on, to become that person who strives not just for success, but for meaning. Studying absorbed me completely. I saw children in front of me, little patients whom I could help someday. This dream was bigger than myself, bigger than my worries. In this passion, I finally found the peace that I had been looking for so many years. University friends, with whom we discussed anatomy at night and treated each other for stress during break hours, shared my goals and lifted me up like wings. But as soon as I felt happy, the shadows of the past reminded me of themselves again, obscuring the sun. It seemed that my parents could not allow me to gain freedom from their imposed ambitions. Their letters and messages appeared unexpectedly, like heavy, inexorable rains, hinting that I had not yet exhausted their expectations. That evening, when I was already preparing for the exam, the screen of my phone blinked, taking me out of the stream of thoughts. The message from Michael was short but alarming. "Can we talk? I need to figure everything out." I immediately felt uneasy. "Of course, come," I replied without hesitation, ready to support him the way he once supported me. When Michael entered the room, I immediately saw how the tension distorted his features, made him look older and more silent. He sighed heavily, running his hand through his tousled hair, as if by this gesture he could rid himself of accumulated oppression. "I can't take it anymore, Lily. They're just relentless," he breathed out with that desperation that was so familiar to me. His voice was laced with disappointment, and there was hopelessness in his eyes. "They think I'm wasting my life on music. They are sure that this is only a temporary infatuation, that one day I will come to my senses and become who they want me to be." In his words, I felt an echo of my own suffering, as if I could hear myself again, the one who once had difficulty finding her way among the fragments of other people's expectations. "But you know that's not true," I said, softly but confidently, choosing my words like a conspiracy to dissolve his doubts. "You're talented, Michael. You deserve to follow your passion." He nodded, but I could see that his gaze remained somewhere far away, as if he was still wandering in the maze of his contradictions. "Every time I try to talk to them, it's like talking to a wall," he said, and bitterness barely slipped into his tone. His words pierced me. I knew this feeling. I knew what it was like to knock on closed doors, to see in the eyes of my parents not understanding, but a wall of cold disapproval. We sat side by side in silence, and in that silence I felt the full weight of his struggle. His frustration and anger, which he had hidden under a mask of indifference, were now exposed. I reached out and squeezed his hand tightly. "Maybe it's time to confront them, Michael," I suggested, and my words seemed to pave the way in his mind. "You have the right to be happy." He nodded silently, although his eyes still expressed concern. He didn't want to lose his parents, despite the pain they caused him. "You know, it's difficult. It's hard to stand up for yourself when you feel like you're tearing apart the very fabric of your family," he muttered, and at that moment I felt our destinies intertwine in this eternal search for recognition. But now I knew that we had a power that even the deepest wounds could not deprive us of. As time passed, days turned into weeks, and I was immersed in my studies again, but the impending confrontation with my parents hung over Michael and me like an invisible cloud, casting a shadow over everything we did. One evening I found a message from my mother on my phone. "We'd like to have a family dinner, Lily." "It's important," her voice said, cool but unyielding. I answered automatically, feeling a feeling of anxiety rising inside, as if twisted by a spring. My father's words sounded almost ominous. His voice seemed to betray not so much confusion as undisguised resentment, as if I had violated some sacred order. I looked straight into his eyes, not looking away, not giving in to the usual impulse to apologize, soften the corners, try to explain. I no longer have the strength to justify myself. I've put up with it for too long, trying to be a comfortable, exemplary daughter that they could be proud of, and not the person that I really was. "Why not?" I repeated, and there was a barely audible note of desperation in my voice that I was trying to contain. "Didn't you teach me to be honest, to stand up for my principles? Or did this role stop working when my principles turned out to be different from yours?" Mom was sitting across from him, her lips pressed tightly together, the pallor on her cheeks betraying a deep emotion that she was desperately trying not to show. She has always been the one who advocated peace and harmony, trying at all costs to drown out uncomfortable conversations and hide us under the cover of a fake world. But this time I won't let her hide behind her usual mask. "We just want you to make the right choice, Lily." Her voice trembled, but the words were as hard as if they were carved out of stone. "You can't give your life to a job that leaves you with nothing. Understand that medicine is not a profession for women. Not for those who want to be a part of society, not its shadow." Her words sounded like a production, like a curse. I tried to understand why they had such a cold misunderstanding, this obvious unwillingness to accept my passion and my freedom. Was it fear for me or just a habit of controlling everything and everyone around me? Maybe they really believed that I was doomed to fail if I went my own way. I felt Michael's hand on my shoulder, supporting me. He knew the price of my struggle, because he himself had gone through similar trials. His presence, confidence, and openness became my only anchor amid this storm of misunderstanding and disappointment. "How ironic," he said bitterly, looking directly at our parents. "You've always told us that family is a fortress, but what kind of fortress is it if every time someone wants to be themselves, you come down on them with your roles and requirements? You tear us apart yourself, and then you expect us to be grateful for it." His voice was saturated not only with resentment, but also with long years of pent-up anger. Michael always suffered in silence, rarely revealing his feelings, but now I saw how those walls began to crumble. He was no longer going to be just a shadow, agreeing to what was being forced on him. He wanted them to see how badly they had hurt us. My father looked at us both coldly. His gaze seemed to pierce through us, as if we did not exist at all. As always, there was a shadow of disappointment in his eyes, which I learned to recognize as a child. "Do you dare to talk to us like that?" "What is it?" he said, and there was no anger in his voice, but rather icy incomprehension. "Michael, you've never known what a real family is if you think that everything in this world comes down to your desires. We've given you everything, and you can't even listen to us." I felt this cold wall of rejection coming down on me, but this time it couldn't stop me anymore. For the first time, I felt that I had power, and that its source was not in my parents' approval, but in my own determination. As I stood at the entrance to our new community center, a sense of accomplishment swept over me like sunlight pouring through clouds after a long and dark storm. The joyful and slightly timid faces of the children looked at me, each of whom seemed to personify a small part of myself. I saw in them a thirst for freedom, curiosity, and sometimes a desperate need for support and understanding. And now I knew, Michael and I, having gone through pain and battles, have created this place where they will not have to justify their dreams, where no one will force them into the framework of other people's expectations. Nancy was standing next to me, her eyes shining with pride, and her warmth supported me just as it had all along the way. She was not just a mentor, but that rare person who saw potential in me when even I doubted it myself. Her presence today was more than just a support, it became a symbol of faith, faith in me, faith in the changes that we are creating together. Nancy was not only a witness to my path, but also a part of my becoming, and in her smile, in the light squeeze of my hand, I found the strength for the next step. Michael stood a little way off, surrounded by a small group of teenagers who looked at him with admiration. He told them about music, about his first steps, about how important it is not to betray your dreams. His voice was soft, but there was strength and confidence in his words. I watched him and couldn't help but admire his courage. Michael has learned to stand up for himself, to resist not only our parents, but also the inner fear that has kept him in the shadows for so long. He had found himself, and I knew that now he had become an example for these children, inspiring them to find their way. Our parents slowly entered the center, carefully examining the space created by our hands and hearts. It was strange to see them here, in this place, symbolizing everything they had once refused to listen to. Their faces seemed older and softer, and their eyes no longer had that unshakable severity that had defined our childhood for so long. Mom came up to me first, smiling cautiously, as if she was afraid to break the silence of this new world. "Lily, this place," she stammered, her voice filled with surprise and, it seemed, a slight tremor. "I didn't know it would be so alive," she added, her eyes darting over the bright walls, bookshelves, and sports equipment. My father took a step towards us, his face was serious, but I caught something new in his gaze, something almost timid. He slowly looked around the room, his eyes lingering on every child, on every corner of our center, as if trying to see everything that had previously remained incomprehensible to him. "You know, Lily," he said softly, avoiding my eyes, "maybe we really missed something important. All this way, all this struggle," his voice trembled, and I saw how he was trying to cope with his stubbornness, which had been an armor for him for so long. "We just wanted you and Michael to be safe. We were so afraid that you would get burned that we forgot about the most important thing." There were subtle signs of internal struggle on his face, as if he was trying to re-understand us and our aspirations. There was still no complete reconciliation in this confession, but it was still the first step, what I needed to hear for so long. "Dad," I smiled at him softly, feeling the last ice of my stubbornness dissolve. "We have to find our own way. It won't always be safe, but it's ours. And there is happiness in this path." Michael, meanwhile, came up to us and quietly hugged his father, without unnecessary words, as if feeling that this gesture contained everything that words could not convey. His embrace was warm and strong, and there was a sincerity in it that our parents had been trying to find for so long. When we went outside, the evening sun was already enveloping the city in warm light, painting everything around in soft, warm shades. There were many roads ahead of us, new challenges and opportunities, but now I knew that I would not be able to go through them alone.